Hi, my name is Teresa Lopez Castro, and I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker. Ann S. Masten, PhD, is a Regents professor and the Irving B. Harris Professor of Child Development in the Institute of Child Development at the University of Minnesota. Professor Masten's research focuses on understanding processes that promote competence and prevent problems in human development, with a focus on resilience in the context of high cumulative risk, adversity, and trauma. She directs the project competence research on risk and resilience, including studies of normative populations and high-risk young people exposed to war, natural disasters, poverty, homelessness, migration, and related adversities. She recently co-chaired the Forum on Investing in Young Children Globally for the U.S. National Academies, while also serving on their board on children, youth, and families. She has served as president of the Society for Research in Child Development and president of Division 7, Developmental, of the American Psychological Association. In 2014, she received the Bronfenbrenner Award for lifetime contributions to developmental psychology in the service of science and society from APA. Please welcome Ann Masten.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here presenting. It's a rather intimidating room, but I'm glad you've all joined the party here. Let's see if I can get these slides working. My first job is to tell you I have no commercial relationships to disclose and no conflicts of interest with this presentation. I also want to disclose that I will be providing a handout version with the slides and the resources that will be sent out to you after this presentation. So relax and listen and reflect during the talk. Okay. My goals today are to talk about the meaning of resilience, the definition, and argue for a multisystemic definition that's scalable across levels and disciplines. I'll highlight what we're learning, and I want to describe the implications of a systems perspective on resilience for how we think about preparing for, responding to, and intervening to help people in the context of adversity. And finally, I want to talk about the road to the future a bit for you. Here's my little roadmap of where I'm going to go on this talk. And I think you can follow along without me going into detail about this. As you're all keenly aware, we live in turbulent times, and there are signs of this all around us. Many of us flew in from cities having record-setting temperatures. We have fires burning around the world. And of course, you can look at data on things like the rising number of disasters, the rising number of terror attacks in graphs like these. And you can also plot loss events and see the same sort of rising turbulence that is facing us globally. At the same time, in developmental science, we have more and more evidence and alarm about lifelong effects of early exposure to toxic stress and other forms of adversity. And so I don't think it's surprising that the interest in resilience is surging across many fields. I think we're scared, and we should be. Fear is a mobilizing emotion, and we have a lot of mobilizing to do in order to deal with the adversities that are facing us now globally. I think it's interesting to note that it was another time of great turbulence in human history that a lot of the seeds of what we now see as resilient science were planted. Of course, this was a terrible time globally, a great deal of loss, but many people got interested in the impact of trauma, not only on adults, but the impact of trauma on children. And another thing that happened as a result of World War II is that 3 people who would become pioneering scientists in the study of resilience were directly affected by World War II, and that stayed with them. Here they are. This is Norman Garmezy, who was my mentor, and he was a soldier in World War II. He fought in the Battle of the Bulge as a young man. and that deeply affected him. He would later go on to join this group of scientists who started out studying people at risk for developing mental health problems, and then this pioneering group realized that a lot of the people in their risk groups were actually doing well, sometimes surprisingly well, and they began to realize the importance of understanding the phenomenon of good adaptation in the context of high risk. Emmy Werner, of course, I'm sure you know, is the founder of the Children of Kwai, the classic study of resilience, still the most important longitudinal study of resilience. Emmy was one of those kids in Europe in World War II who survived the bombing, but would not have survived the aftermath of starvation and other problems without the support of people from all over the world through UNICEF, the United Nations founding to help kids like her, and through Save the Children packages, these care packages that came from all over the place. And she wrote a beautiful book about first-hand accounts of children in World War II. But she immigrated to the United States and later would go on to be the principal investigator of that famous study. And Michael Rutter was one of the children who was evacuated from England during the Blitz to protect children. He and his sister were sent across the ocean to the United States to protect them from bombing. I think I always had a soft spot for Americans after that. But he went back to England and grew up to be the leading child psychiatrist in the world and very interested in the phenomenon of resilience, and he's still publishing very influential work. So this group of people started off trying to understand the origins of psychopathology and how it develops, and they landed on recognition of resilience. And what they realized was that it wasn't just a phenomenon of interest, that we needed to understand how this happens. How is it that some kids in very high-risk situations and backgrounds grow up to be healthy individuals, others flounder, and still others have kind of a roller coaster life. And they realized that we had been focusing on risks and deficits and problems and didn't really understand very much about the positive side of the story. And they set out to address that problem. So resilience science really emerged around 1970. And in the ensuing 50 years, of course, we've had decades of unbelievable adversity. The adversity continues. And of course, I think it's surging right now. We also have had 50 years of science, and there have been many advances in what we know about resilience and what people are learning, and there's a really huge body of literature, and you'll be happy to know I'm not going to try to cover it all this morning. But we have had dramatic advances in the methodology that's available to scientists in this area. For example, unimaginable to the pioneers, like being able to image the human brain in action while it's problem solving. We can upload biological data from field locations up to satellites and have it, assembled for data analysis. We have major advances in trying to understand neurobiological processes that go into resilience phenomena that protect against various kinds of risks for psychopathology. But we also have much more interest in research on cultural factors and processes and studies from around the world. The early research was really concentrated in a small number of countries, as often happens in research. But now we have a lot of researchers from the global south who are contributing to our understanding of resilience and really enriching what we know about these processes. And there's a lot of collaboration happening, and particularly striking to me in recent years has been the partnering of humanitarian agencies like Mercy Corps and other agencies like that with researchers. And I think that's a real winning combination. And another thing that has happened is that we've realized that we need a common language if we're going to tackle the problems in front of us. And this is the definition of resilience I would propose in that light. The capacity of a system, I'm interested in systems like that little girl there in the photo in particular, but this definition is intended to refer to any system, to work across different kinds of systems, a child, a family, an economy, you know, any kind of dynamic system. So the capacity of a system to adapt successfully to challenges that threaten system function, survival, or development. And I think we need this kind of definition because the problems that face us in the times we live in are multi-system, complex, and they're going to require that we integrate not only what we know, but what we do about it. These are complex problems that involve multiple systems, and we have to be able to synthesize, to harmonize what we know, and to harmonize our interventions and actions to prepare for disaster, to address mass-level casualties, and so forth. Now, systems are embedded, interacting, and interdependent. So this child's life here is connected to many other people, just as an example. And you can see the child down there in the bottom. But inside the child are multiple systems, an immune system, many kinds of cardiovascular systems operating to help this child stay alive and respond well to adversity. But that child is connected to other systems outside the child's body. And these are the famous microsystems and macrosystems that Bronfenbrenner taught us about and emphasized. He said, you cannot just look at what's inside a person to understand development in a person's life. You have to understand all the ecological systems that play a role in human development. And they're interconnected with each other. And a child may not directly interact with each of these other systems, but indirectly, the policies of a state or a government, the resilience in a community can affect a child's life. So human development emerges from interactions of many systems across levels. And this is the famous picture diagram of this by Gottlieb that many of you may have seen before, from a genetic molecular kind of a level all the way up to many levels of the environment and experience. So this means that resilience, the capacity we have to respond to adversity, depends on many systems, and it reflects processes that can be engaged to adapt to the disturbances and challenges that confront us, and these can be mobilized to either restore equilibrium in some situations, to counteract challenges, or in some cases to transform the system so that it can thrive and survive. But the capacity that human beings have for resilience has been shaped through eons of biological and cultural evolution. There's three defining questions that have to be addressed in research or just thinking about resilience. And I'm going to give an individual example because I'm a psychologist. But if Froma Walsh were here, she could present the same three questions, focusing on a family system. And Fran Norris could do it for a community system and so forth. But these are the questions you have to not just ask to think conceptually about resilience, but to operationalize and measure and do empirical research on resilience. First question, what are the challenges? Resilience is about what happens in the context of challenges and threats. And many different kinds of challenges have been studied over the years. And there's many kinds of challenges represented at this conference as well. There are people who study specific kinds of trauma or cumulative trauma, those who study maltreatment and neglect or natural disasters or terror attacks and what happens after that, people who study children and war survivors and refugees, and people who study the popular approach these days of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. So we have lots of different kinds of research on lots of different kinds of threats that have been studied. The second big question is, how is the person doing? How is the system doing? We have to have criteria for that. How do we measure how a system is doing. And in the case of a child or an adult, for example, people use different parameters of adapting well. What does it mean to adapt well? I'm a developmental scientist, so I'm often looking at developmental task criteria. Is this child doing what we would expect a child to be doing at this period of development in this context? So, if you're talking about an elementary school child, is that child going to school and getting along with the teacher and the other children and learning something while they're there and, listening to their parents and so forth? As people get older, we have different criteria. Criteria vary somewhat, of course, in different cultures as well as different periods of history. Some people focus instead on mental health or symptoms of mental health not being very good, such as PTSD as their kind of criteria. Some people focus on physical health, some on wellness or psychological well-being. There's all kinds of criteria that people have studied. Now, what is the third and critical question? The third question is, what fosters adaptive success? Given the challenges that are under study or consideration and the criteria that one has for doing well, evaluating whether a system is doing well, what makes a difference? These are the factors, the resilience factors that people have focused on trying to understand. And I just listed here the different levels of analysis that people have considered, because I'm going to talk in more detail about the resilience factors themselves. So from a systems perspective, resilience is dynamic. Your resilience and mine are always changing because our environment's always changing, we're developing and changing all the time. Everything we experience is changing us. So resilience is dynamic. It fluctuates over time. And the capacity for adaptation that you or I or anyone has is distributed across systems. You don't rely just on your own self, your own mind, your own body to respond to adversity. You can draw on the capacity that's embedded in your relationships, in your community, and I'll come back to that. And this means that the resilience of a single individual, like a child, is going to depend on the resilience in other systems, how much capacity they have to help out. So a child depends on the resilience of a family. Families depend on the resilience of communities and other families around them. Another implication of this kind of a systems perspective is that diverse pathways of adaptation are expected. And, of course, they're observed as well. The course of development can be described as a pathway kind of over your life course, but it's also the case that the course of response to a challenge or adversity can be described as a pathway. Patterns of adaptive function vary over time in relation to adversity or challenges. And so people have talked about pathways of resilience. Here are some examples of pathways of resilience. On the left side is patterns that people have theoretically expected and also verified in many cases for acute onset trauma. And then on the right is a different kind of pattern in the context of severe, overwhelming, chronic adversity. I study children, and it's important to think about the chronic side as well. In the case of acute trauma, the three patterns people often discuss of resilience kinds of pathways, and these reflect the manifestations of resilience. Pattern A is often called stress resistance. Pattern B is usually breakdown and recovery. Pattern B is actually quite normative when in the case of acute overwhelming stress. And pattern C is usually described as post-traumatic growth. And that's been discussed much more, as you may be aware, as in older kids and adults rather than very small children. Now, in the case of chronic adversity, when you have children overwhelmed with, they're in a horrible orphanage or they're caught up in a family with ongoing violence and sexual assault, for example, what you observe is not really resilience. You observe deterioration or poor functioning because there are conditions under which no person can develop well and thrive. But where you look for resilience with this kind of overwhelming chronic adversity is when conditions improve. And then you begin to see the resilience emerge, when the conditions make it possible for either resources are mobilized and so forth. And here's a few examples of resilience after chronic adversity. And there are talks at this conference on some of these topics. When a child is moved to a better situation, or children are adopted into a loving family from a neglecting orphanage, or refugees find a safe new homeland where they can settle and be supported, or child soldiers are rescued and supported as they recover. Then you begin to see patterns of resilience. Not everybody recovers, however. Sometimes there's harmful damage done in severe adversity, and it may take a long time, or you may see the consequences of that adversity endure over time. Let me go back to this diverse pathways picture. This one has a couple more pathways, broadening out to include some of the pathways that don't show resilience. Pattern D is an immediate breakdown following an acute, overwhelming stressor without recovery, at least not yet. And pattern E shows hanging on for a while and then a breakdown. It's a delay. And this, I think, is an example of a depletion pattern where a person had capacity and resources and they got worn out. They got overwhelmed after a while. I want to show you 3 of those patterns where, in this picture here, the high is good, right? We're looking at an measure of a good functioning of some sort. So high is good and low is negative. But if you measure something like symptoms, and many people at this conference are interested in post-traumatic symptoms. If you're measuring symptoms, then this is what the patterns would look like. They're upside down, basically. And I wanted to show you this because some of the most interesting empirical work that's presented here and in journals is focused on post-traumatic stress symptoms in the before and after an acute disaster. So there's pattern A down there, resistance, kind of a steady course. People wobble, of course, but they're hanging in there. Pattern B, you see a flare-up of symptoms and then a recovery, and that's not unusual in a acute trauma situation. That's why we wait to diagnose PTSD. You give time for this to occur. Maybe not enough time, but certainly we give some time. And then pattern D is breakdown, and so far the recovery hasn't happened. And sometimes you see that pattern, and sometimes people get worse. So I wanted to show you some empirical examples, because one of the big advances that we've seen over time in the study of resilience is more and more empirical data and the statistical methods in place to look at some of these patterns. And in this case, Annette LaGreca, Wendy Silverman, and their colleagues were able to go back and use modern statistical strategies to analyze data they had collected right after Hurricane Andrew. So this publication is pretty recent, but Hurricane Andrew occurred in 1992. But they went back and they identified trajectories. Now, they didn't have measures before the hurricane. They went 3 times to see how the kids were doing, measuring post-traumatic symptoms, and they identified these 3 patterns. People who were started in the clinical range and were slightly improving maybe over time, but were still pretty much in the clinical range. They called that the chronic group. And they had the recovering group that had a lot of symptoms and then were recovering over time. And they also had what they called the resilient group, this sort of group that looked pretty good, at least after the hurricane. And the big problem that many researchers face who study impact of acute adversities like this is that we don't really know how people were doing before the hurricane or whatever. So it's hard to identify whether the empirical data fit the theoretical patterns since we don't have the before. And this is a problem in many kinds of research. And this is the reason that people were super excited not by earthquakes happening, but by the advent of measures that allow you to go back in time. And so an exciting advance, and there's probably some presentations on this here, people have gotten very interested in the measurement of hair cortisol, because your hair, you know how your body keeps the score from stress? Your hair keeps a diary of cortisol, and that's sort of a cumulative overall index of stress exposure. And if you take samples of hair, you can cut it up and analyze it, knowing how much hair on average grows a month. And the hair close to your head is recent, and the hair further out, you can actually go back before an acute trauma. Now, this technique's going to need some work to make sure we've got the reliability and validity and understand, like, how does shampoo affect this and whatever. But there's great data coming out showing using hair cortisol for a variety of reasons, not just to backtrack before an earthquake, but also to see how an intervention changes cumulative stress after, you know, in a refugee camp, for example, like Catherine Panterbrick and her colleagues are doing. But in this picture, what you're looking at is data from these investigators who measured hair cortisol. They measured it, you see where it says S1 on the bottom? That's the hair segment closest to where they made the cuts of hair. These are Chinese girls who experienced the Sichuan earthquake, and they looked at two groups of kids, but they divided them in this chart into 3 groups. And what they found is that the girls who were proximally located near the earthquake zone and experienced more devastation and loss, they're the ones in that line that spike upward. The red arrow indicates when the earthquake occurred. So they went backwards, and they have hair cortisol before the earthquake at S4. They measure right after the segment that represents right when the earthquake happened or shortly after. And you get much higher cortisol levels in the hair of girls that were close. Everybody in China was affected by this earthquake. It's one of those events that reverberates through society. But the further away girls didn't have as high a level of cort. And then they also, I figured out which girls developed PTSD and which girls did not. And they show different patterns after S3. They split off into 2 groups. And it looks like the cortisol level falls off among the group that develops PTSD. I just want to move on, but what was important about this study was that it brought to people's attention that here was a measure where you could actually go back before an acute, unexpected trauma to measure something about stress and look for patterns. Another kind of work has been done by Joy and Howard Osofsky. Many of you may know them. They were very involved in the recovery from Katrina as well as the BP oil spill. And they have followed a large group of kids in the Gulf region over time. This is all post-Katrina, and post Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And they're just following people over time and measuring their post-traumatic symptoms. And in this trajectory analysis, they identified 4 groups: the stable high group, the decreasing group, the low increasing group, so they're getting worse over time, and the stable low group. In all of the pictures like this that I'm showing you, one of the most striking things is the salience of, in the end, good outcomes or recovery. There's a strong picture of recovery not only in this data, but in a lot of data that looks at trajectories. Not everybody improves over time, and one of the most important areas of research is understanding why, for example, to those bottom 2 lines, who started off at time 1 about the same place, why do they separate? Is there something about the individual sensitivity? Is there something about the recovery environment? I mean, there's a lot of research going on trying to understand these patterns, explain these different trajectory patterns of recovery. And here's a recent one. This was in the Journal of Traumatic Stress. these are the trajectories of post-traumatic stress for children exposed to violence using the long scan data set. And again, here they identified 3 groups, but we have a clinical improving group. I'm sorry, I forgot to tell you, these are all kids, people who've been exposed to child maltreatment and violence before the age of 8, in the early years typically. And then they use the longitudinal follow-up data, age 8, 12, and 16, to look at the patterns from that point on. So this is post maltreatment and violence exposure. And you see here the clinical improving group, 25%, the borderline stable group, and the resilient group. And again, you see the salience of the resilience group. So there's complexities in these kinds of patterns and trajectories. There's not only variation in different people, there's variation within the same people. So some people will show good functioning in one domain and not so good in another. So they might be, doing really well at school, but they feel terrible and they're distressed and depressed. They may not be sleeping. You also have the possibility of variable adaptation at different levels of analysis. So, you may, and this has become a very hot research topic, you may look good on the outside, going to school and whatever, but you may be feeling like you're suicidal, and deeper inside your body, if we measured it biologically, could be showing allostatic load. So you can, measure things at different levels. Your immune system may show up the impact of adversity in a different way than your behavior, for example. There's also roller coaster adaptation. A lot of the early family stress researchers pointed this out, that you can go up and down depending on what's happening. We can have variable adaptation at different points in the life course. Some people do fine in childhood and then stumble in adolescence. The demands of adolescence are different. The tools we have are different. And we also see late bloomers, people who struggle in adolescence, but then succeed in the transition to adulthood. Their brain changes, their opportunities change, they pull their act together, and they grow up to be successful young people. So this question of different levels of analysis is an important one that's getting a lot of attention lately. People ask this question: is it possible to show good adaptation at one level of adaptation and problems or breakdown at another? And the answer, of course, is yes to this question. This was observed even in Emmy Werner's pioneering study of the children of Kauai. If you read the follow-up into adult life, the group of resilient kids on the island of Kauai who'd experienced a lot of childhood adversity but who had done well over the course of development, they began to show some health symptoms of stress in adulthood. Things like back problems, high blood pressure, that sort of thing, that now people begin to think might be long-term symptoms of allostatic load, carrying a load from the original adversity. And a more recent example would be the interesting work by folks like Gene Brody and his colleagues. He wrote this very captivating title for his paper, Is Resilience Only Skin Deep? By which he meant that, he, along with Velma Murray, has carried out this wonderful intervention study with African American families in the South. And they were following these families, and their intervention worked. And then they started studying biological level, and they found that the kids at age 19 or so who were succeeding, they're looking good, that they were showing signs of allostatic load on the inside, because these were kids that were still dealing with discrimination, and it required a lot of strain and effort to achieve in the world that they lived in, even with family support, and that maybe their biology was indicating a cost there. We'll see as they follow these kids what the long-term story is. But this is a very important kind of question to be asking. So what have we learned? Well, we certainly, over all these decades of research on resilience, have learned that lots of factors play a role in these pathways we're talking about and in the nature of resilience and adaptation to adversity. And I've listed them here. Certainly the dose or the type of exposure that a person is experiencing makes a difference, and there are many elements to that. We know that context matters. If something happens, for example, I'm going to talk later about the meltdown of Fukushima in the tsunami in 2011. When you have a nuclear meltdown in Japan, it has a different kind of meaning than a meltdown somewhere else. They've had a lot of bad experiences with nuclear radiation from atomic bombing over the years, and it sensitized the people to that. Similarly, in an individual person's life, if you have a history of trauma or cultural experiences that have affected you, you carry that into a situation. But, at different points in history, we have different resources. Developmental timing matters. If something happens, there are sensitive windows for experiencing trauma where it affects brain development more than it does at other times, or it affects the way our biology organizes itself. So it matters when, developmentally speaking, you're exposed to adversity as well. But also, developmental timing matters in many other ways. It matters for the criteria we use. It matters for what kind of tools people can bring to the table in terms of their own development. And our expectations vary with development as well. Individual differences matter, and there are biological sessions at this conference talking about biological individual differences, and for a long time people have studied cognitive individual differences that provide either vulnerabilities or protective tools for how people handle adversity. And then I'm going to talk about how other ecological systems matter here in a minute. One of the most interesting things to me over the past few years is realizing, as the literatures start to come together on resilience from different disciplines and researchers, how well they line up. And I remember the first time I met Froma Walsh at a conference a number of years ago. We'd both been studying resilience for a long time. Me more studying children, her studying families and doing family therapy to promote resilience. And we both had the same reaction when we met each other for the first time at this interdisciplinary conference. Like, how come we haven't met before? And why is there so little crossover in these two literatures? I mean, the child literature and the family resilience literature had surprisingly little interaction and cross-citations, even though they were dealing with a lot of the same sort of situations. So we both decided we had to do something about that. But anyway, as we started to kind of look at these two literatures, I recently published this paper. This list is from the Journal of Family Theory and Research, just kind of paralleling what are the most common protective factors identified in the individual research on resilience. I study mostly kids and young people, but generally speaking. And then how does that line up with the resilience factors that have come out of the family resilience literature that Froma reviews beautifully in her books and so forth? And I think these line up strikingly well, even whether you're looking at the resilience of individuals or the resilience of a family. When you're looking at an individual, you're talking about, what protects this child or this teenager or this adult. And for a child, far and away the most important protective factor is a nurturing, caregiving adult in their life. Attachment, the security that comes with attachment, that sort of thing. But we also have protective factors like hope, meaning, and so forth. Nothing, I think, on this list will surprise you. And for those of you who attended the opening session last night, I was struck by the presentations of the two wonderful speakers telling their personal stories of resilience. a refugee and from Somalia and a survivor of the Boston Marathon bombing, how often this list of protective factors came up in their talk about, you could read between the lines, and they kept talking about these kinds of protective factors. But if you look at the family level, you see the same thing, only now we're talking about, you're looking at a family system is the unit of analysis, not the individual. But, a family provides nurturing care, and that's important for all the members of the vulnerable family. A family can have a culture of hope and optimism. Families have meaning and coherence, and so forth. So I think it's quite striking how well these parallel. I also wanted to show you, not to talk about in detail, but Pauline Boss, who of course has done this amazing work with her collaborators on ambiguous loss, asked me if I would write about how the literature on resilience in ambiguous loss lined up with the research on individual resilience. And this is just a chart from the paper I wrote at her request, also published in the Journal of Family Theory and Research. And again, there was a lot of parallels that came out in that. Now, there aren't many systematic reviews in the resilience literature. I'm sure you can surmise why that might be. People use too many different definitions and measures of resilience. It really puts a barrier in front of people who want to do systematic reviews. Hopefully this will improve in the future. So there are hardly any good systematic reviews of what makes a difference in the resilience literature. And it's not surprising that one of the first systematic reviews would be focused on child maltreatment and violence, because that literature has matured the most, it's the most extensive. And so this paper by Meng et al., published in 2018, and I will give you all the resources in the handout I send around. This is just to show you that, when they analyzed all the research that met their criteria, 80-something studies, what were the most common protective factors? And you can see some familiar themes. Now, they're not organizing them in the same way I would. They were stuck organizing them with the way that the writers of these articles organized them. It's not as systematic. But I think you can see how in a systematic review, you see a lot of these same themes coming out, these same resilience factors. Now I want to focus on community resilience and raise the question of whether you see the same kinds of adaptive systems parallel in the community level. We've talked about individual and family. And I want to just start by, the definition of community resilience here from Fran Norris's classic paper published in 2008. Where she this group talked about community resilience as a process, linking a set of networked adaptive capacities to a positive trajectory of functioning and adaptation in constituent populations after a disturbance. This approach is very much in alignment with the current contemporary definitions of resilience. Another thing this group did that was super important was to identify the finding that adaptive capacities, they're talking about communities, but the same is true of families and individuals. The adaptive capacities that really matter are robust, redundant, and rapidly accessible. And I would argue that they also have surge capacity. Really powerful protective factors like parents have surge capacity. When the going gets tough, they can up their game to protect their children. Now, here's a proposed list of parallels at the community level, and you can just think about this. There's a lot of interest in community resilience these days, and I think that we'll have a more systematic way of making a list of parallels like this down the road. I just wanted to share with you what my thinking is about this. You want a picture? I'll go back. There you go. Picture time. Okay. And obviously there are connections between levels. So what's happening at a community level can connect with what's happening at an individual level. And we haven't got quite the type of measures I'd like to see that connect these different levels. But one way you can connect is to look like these folks did in Washington State at the degree to which an individual's sense of community, their perception of community, and the well-being, is related to that individual's report on their own well-being. And this is what is plotted here is ACE scores. So people gave the ACEs they had, and it's going from low to high. And then what you're looking at is the sense of community as a protective factor for well-being. If you had a pile of ACEs in your life, if you also had a positive sense of your community, then that was related to better feeling better. We need more research of that kind. There's a whole community resilience movement unfolding, as I'm sure you're aware in some of your work. Rockefeller famously has funded 100 resilient cities. Minneapolis is one of them. We have a resilience coordinator for the city of Minneapolis, and they've done that in all 100 cities. But they're very focused on urban resilience and the capacity of individuals, communities, and so forth to survive, adapt, and grow no matter what. And that's, again, very much in line with modern systems theories of resilience. And the city of Los Angeles, in collaboration with Rand Corporation, who are great at synthesizing stuff for people, they've done a project on community resilience as well. They define the resilience in a community as the capacity of the community to prepare for, respond to, and recover from adverse events. And of course, LA is getting constant reminders with the fires about why it's so important for them to get prepared. And I like this point they make in their report, which you can find online for free. This is about moving from the me to the we, to the us. When the fire is coming up the hill, everybody has to participate in addressing the problem and in getting prepared for the next problem. And it's interesting to watch the conversations shift from earthquake to fire. Here's Rockefeller's 7 qualities of resilient cities, just so you know how they think about it. They like the number 7 probably. But I think a lot of these qualities line up pretty well with resilience in other kinds of systems, thinking from a city level perspective. Here's a book I like, Daniel Aldrich's book on building resilience. And he says high levels of social capital is the core engine of recovery, connecting all the systems. I want to highlight one experience I had on community resilience that I found very meaningful when I visited the area that was destroyed by the 2011 tsunami in Japan. This was the result of the triple disaster that occurred in March of 2011 when they had a massive earthquake, one of the largest ever recorded offshore. When that earthquake propagated a tsunami, they think that Fukushima survived the earthquake, but they had underestimated the height of the tsunami wave that would come through. It came through at twice the level they were prepared for, flooded the reactor, which is why it melted down, and is still basically melting down. I mean, there's still radiation problems there. People can't go in there. Anyway, I grew up in Japan a little bit for a while. I grew up in the military, and I spent several years in Japan living in the Sendai area when I was a child. And I want to show you these pictures of Ishinomaki. This was an area destroyed when the tsunami came in. And on the left picture, you'll see what the little town by the river looked like before the tsunami. And then this beautiful, haunting photograph was taken just in the afternoon of the day of the tsunami. And what you can really strikes you about this picture is it was cold. It was March. It was snow here in the picture when this happened. And many people in this little community lost their lives. And the photographer here is Aishi Hanma, who I'm going to talk about in a minute. And he felt the earthquake. Everybody felt the earthquake. it was enormous. But he realized he had to run up the hill behind him. The people who didn't immediately run up to higher ground were lost in this tsunami. But he ran up and took this hauntingly beautiful photograph. And here's Aishi. The picture at the bottom is what the community looked like when the water receded, but standing down on the lower ground, looking up and out. The only building that survived is that little black and white building there. It was a very strong little warehouse building of this family, the Hanma family warehouse, it's known as. And there's Aichi there standing. Underneath, if you look up on the building, you'll see there's I can hardly tell, there's a tsunami wave on the building. A lot of the buildings in this area are now marked, bridges, everything, marked with a tsunami wave at the level the water came through. So people know, it's to help people remember how high the water came through. Anyway, this building survived, and what Hanma has done, along with the help of this group of historians, is create a museum about what happened in this building. And they're rebuilding the whole area now. But people bring their artifacts and memories and put them in this little warehouse building. And he showed me and others around when I visited. It's a very moving experience to go there. But what he has done with the group, these historians in Japan go around and they digitize the records of the Japanese families, because they tend to keep their records on like little scrolls that are not very waterproof or fireproof. And so they've been trying to digitize historical records for communities. And this historical group came in and helped to restore a lot of the documents, and they had digitized already in key documents from many of the families in the area. So together, these historians, and I never had thought about historians as a protective factor before, but historians can help restore a community's sense of coherence and meaning. And Hanma has created a center of community in this town, and people can come there and visit and get married and whatever. So resilience has had transformational effects on practice, and this has occurred in many fields. Basically, shifting the focus, not to ignore risk and trauma, but to broaden out the focus to include strengths and assets, positive pathways, not just problems and negative pathways, protective factors, and building capacity at multiple levels. And here's a resilience framework for action. I'm not going to talk in detail about this, but I wanted to show you some examples. From the very outset, the resilience researchers knew that people in trouble, child or adult, couldn't wait for resilient scientists to figure everything out. If somebody's in your office or in a refugee camp, you have to take action based on the best evidence you have and the best knowledge you have at the time. And so as the science was growing, this kind of resilience framework was growing, trying to inform practice based on what people were learning. And so these encapsulate some of the lessons learned in a way. So one of the guidelines here in this kind of framework is frame positive objectives. And I think we heard that last night in the opening sessions, that it's important to focus on the positive. That mobilizes people. And almost anything can be reframed into a positive goal. And these are just examples. Treating problems is one way to phrase something, and promoting or restoring health and well-being is another way to frame something. A second thing we have to do is measure and keep track of positives along with problems, not just look at the negative side of things. And this applies to, resources in the environment, and also applies to pathways and outcomes. And just for example, if you're going to measure ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, I would encourage you to consider also measuring benevolent childhood experiences. BEACES, which was a measure created by Alicia Lieberman and my former student, Angela Narayan. And one of her students is here, if you want to know. You can wave over there, Jill, if you want to know more about it. But I'll attach a copy of it in my handout for people. There are 3 basic strategies implicated by the resilience literature for taking action: risk-focused, asset-focused, and mobilizing the big engines of resilience. And let me just say a little bit more about those. Here's some risk-focused examples. And I think an important risk-focused example, I was thinking about this morning listening to Dr. Herman speak. You can't let tyranny stand. I mean, just because you're interested in resilience and you're focusing on resilience, you can't ignore injustice and tyranny. You have to deal with that. And no matter what kind of wonderful things you want to do for children when the war is over, you want to build them a school, be sure you dig up the landmines before you go too far in building the school. We have to address inequality, adversity. There's so many children in the United States and all over the world and adults who are facing way too much adversity, trauma, and oppression. And one of the ways we promote resilience and nurture the future is to address unnecessary adversity and risk, to try to solve the problems of violence and so forth. And here's some other examples as well. I study homelessness, as some of you know. Well, we should prevent that. I knew 30 years ago when I first started doing research on homelessness that it wasn't good for children and other living things. And we really, it's only recently that I see people seriously taking steps to actually, launch massive efforts, which is what we're going to need to really address the homelessness problem we have in this country, which is linked to inequality and injustice. Here's some example of risk-focused community strategies. You got to get the lead out of the water in Flint, Michigan. It's still not quite there, but they're getting better. So you have to have reduce hazards. You have to identify your vulnerabilities and vulnerable areas of the community and try to do something about it. These are just a few examples at the community level. I'm sure there are people in California thinking about these. Here's some asset-focused examples. This is when you try to put more resources or access to resources into the picture. So this might be funding for disaster preparation. In the case of low-income children or neighborhoods, it might be, building schools, providing books, and so forth. So there's lots of ways that we try to prepare. FEMA does this all the time. They try to stage out basic necessities that are going to be needed to make resources available. And then here's the real powerful engines of resilience, the adaptive systems on those individual, family, community levels. These are the big engines of protection that have evolved throughout human life and culture. And so when we foster pro-social bonds at every level, we are building resilience. When we nurture healthy brain development in young children, we are building their future resilience and so forth. So when we, build up we nurture and build resilience at every level, we're mobilizing the big engines. If you, strengthen the family of a child who's suffering, or if you help a child who's suffering, you're mobilizing. When you're mentoring, you're mobilizing the really powerful engines of change. Integration, I see integration happening across levels, which is good. It's happening at theoretically, but it's also happening in action. In our community, there's a lot of 2 or 3 generation intervention programs, recognizing that we need to line up our interventions to promote synergy. We certainly need to do that in disaster response. When all the systems collapse at the same time, you realize how interdependent they are. I want to leave you with some intriguing questions that I think give you a hint about what's happening in the future. I see I have 19 seconds left. I gave myself an hour for this talk. So a few intriguing questions for you. Are there hidden talents or stress-adapted skills we've overlooked? people we think of as maladaptive out there in dangerous environments who actually have developed some skills, some survival skills we need to recognize. Bruce Ellis is very interested in this, as you may know. And how are typically adaptive systems hijacked? You know, your brain can get hijacked in drug addiction. The reward systems are hijacked by drugs. But gang leaders can hijack really positive adaptive systems like mastery motivation and forming close bonds with people, but direct them in a really negative way. We need to understand that better. What are the trade-offs of current resilience for the future? Something your body, your mind may adapt to survive now may not be good in the long run. How is resilience transmitted across generations? We heard a lot about trauma being transmitted. How is resilience transmitted socioculturally? How is it transmitted biologically and so forth? And when and how does adversity exposure foster resilience? You know, people need to have some exposure to stress. Just like your immune system won't optimize unless it has exposure early on to different kinds of challenges. And we get inoculations. I got my flu shot recently to boost up my immune system. We have to have some challenges to optimize what we're able to do. We don't want to overwhelm people, but you do worry sometimes we're overprotecting some populations of kids. And kids need a chance to learn how to get up and how to find resources and solve problems. And another intriguing question is, can harm from adversity exposure during sensitive periods be undone? They talk about that as like biological programming. Are there do-overs possible? Is it possible to reprogram adaptive systems? There are biology types really interested in that question. And then I've kept emphasizing these sort of list of common human adaptive systems. Given that these key adaptive resilience capacities are observed at multiple levels of human systems, from the individual to social levels, how do we think about these? What can we learn about them? Have these systems co-evolved at multiple levels? Is that why there's so many parallels? Which ones occur in other species? If you think about it, there's a mammalian heritage here, but there are people who study animal resilience that are linking up sort of earlier versions or different versions of these same protective systems in other species. On the other hand, which ones are uniquely human? Most people would put meaning or purpose on that list of uniquely human, but do we really know if porpoises have meaning and purpose? I'm not sure we talk their language. And how will all of these adaptive systems be affected by artificial intelligence? That's a pondering one. Okay. Here's my takeaways. Resilience is dynamic. It's always changing. Many systems contribute to the adaptive capacity of everybody and all social systems. We depend on networks of adaptive systems. And I want to say a shout out to all the young scholars in the room. There's a lot to learn, so there's a lot of work for you to be doing in the future. And I think it's on that road to the future. We have to focus on intersystem processes. We have to study the dynamics linking up systems and resilience at different levels. And we have to mobilize and invest in interdisciplinary integration. And that's an important role for a society like this one, which is interdisciplinary. We have to harmonize our theories, our problem solving for the big problems, and our training so that people learn how to interact with each other. And I'm going to say thank you and stop for questions and reflections. Thank you very much. While you're thinking of your question and going to the microphone, I just want to thank all my colleagues and students who've shaped my thinking over the years, and my family and friends who made it possible for me to do the work that I've done. I see somebody coming to ask a question.
Dr. Masten, thank you very much. That was wonderful. As someone who's trying to learn more about resilience, one of the questions I had was, do we know anything about epigenetics of resilience?
Well, there's going to be a symposium on that topic here. Just so you can look up Dante Cicchetti. Yes, well, I would say that we're at the beginning stages of learning. And, people like Dante Cicchetti and Bruce McEwen and Meany and many other people are really looking at the epigenetics of what might be involved in resilience. I think the problem they're wrestling with is that when you think about human behavior and the complexity of human behavior and development, you can imagine it's going to be difficult to sort out. As you go lower levels, more and more things are going to be involved at an epigenetic level. But there are some people starting to look at that, and if you want to preview, I've done a chapter you can write and ask me for with Dante on resilience that covers some of that. But if you just put into Google Scholar resilience epigenetics, you'll get an inkling. But my impression is that literature hasn't solidified yet. We're just at the beginning stages because it's quite complex.
Thank you.
Should we go to the other mic? Mike takes turns. Okay.
Hi, good morning. I wanted to say thank you for your talk. This is the reason I got into the field in the first place, is this subject matter. I wanted to ask you your thoughts about some individuals have now suggested that we need to shift our thinking about how we conceptualize resilience. Rather than focusing on those outcomes, as your slide showed, there's so many different ways to measure them. Should resilience be more about the process of whether or not an individual is trying to cope and adapt, regardless of the outcome? Because as you've shown, even those that do appear resilient, there's that cost. And for many of the patients that I work with, I think about, they're experiencing such chronic adversity and are continuing to accumulate that allostatic load. So is it reasonable to expect that they should be able to adapt? So that's one part of my question. And then the other part is, has anybody in the field thought about measuring resilience as a quotient?
Well, that's a complicated question, but the idea that resilience, I would argue that resilience is a capacity, and people have tried, which implies that there's a quotient. That you have at any given moment. There is no given moment. You can't freeze people, but at a given moment, you have a limited, you don't have unlimited capacity. You have a limited capacity to mobilize. And I think it's analogous to your immune system. Your immune system has a capacity to fight off infections and so forth, which can get overwhelmed. And people try to measure that in different ways, but it's not totally easy to measure that. When people look at pathways, they're actually looking at what they believe to be the manifestations of resilience, not the resilience itself. I would argue that when you look at the outcomes, when you track how well a person is doing, you are looking at you're inferring resilience from the fact that they've experienced adversity and you see that they're doing well by what criteria you're looking at. And from that, we infer that there has been capacity and that the processes that mobilize and put that capacity into action to counteract or overcome adversity have happened. And so resilience, the actual unfolding of resilience and how capacity is translated into adaptation has to be about processes. There are processes of resilience. I think all modern approaches to resilience are focused on processes and understanding how this works. What are the processes by which the capacity that anybody may have can be applied to adapt? And I think that we start with people who have manifested resilience in the sense that, okay, they've been challenged and they're doing pretty well here. What can we learn? What made a difference? We start with that basic question. That was an early question in resilience. What makes a difference? Then we have to ask the second question. How did it make a difference? I mean, what are the processes? Because if we're going to intervene, it's not enough to know what made a difference. We need to know how it made a difference if you're going to try to create it. I hope that's addressed some of your questions. A great question, and it has many layers. And this issue of whether you have to actually show a good outcome, I'm sure that we can study processes of adaptation even when they're not working. And what we may need to do is bolster them up and support them so that they work better. Okay?
Thank you.
And should we go over there and get a turn on that side?
Yes, thank you for a great talk. I was wondering if you could comment. I think it was quite a few years ago I heard at this meeting Dr. King give a description of a very nice model, just looking at a kind of an engineering structural model of resilience. So if you take an iron bar, we can talk about it's resilient if it can't be flexed. We can also talk about if it does flex, does it come back to where it was? How quickly does it come back? Does it overshoot? So there's ways we can kind of quantify the action of resilience. It seems to be a useful model.
Yeah, people are very interested in that kind of model. I think that in the past, engineering models of resilience have been limited because structures or metals are not quite as dynamic as people are. But as we move into the era of artificial intelligence, when people begin to think about the dynamics of resilience of a system, like a computing system, or begin to study artificial intelligence and how are problems solved, how can we teach a computer to learn, machine learning, to learn how to solve its own problems and to recover and so forth, that when we can simulate more of the dynamic capabilities that living systems have, we get closer. But the problem with the early resilience measures, I have a brother who's an engineer, actually lives in town here. He studies metals and how, like why did the Challenger break and explode, that sort of resilience. And there's certain similarities. And the people in ecology study the resilience of soils. And a lot of their concepts are very, very similar. They even have the same pathway drawings of resistance and so forth. But I think what you have to include in these models is the dynamics and the complexity. Now, there are people beginning to write about complex adaptive systems, and it's probably from those people who study networking resilience and complex adaptive systems in ecology and other fields that we will probably glean our mathematical tools to do exactly what you'd like to see happen.
Thank you.
I think we have to stop. I'll be around out in the hall. Thank you.